Today I want to share with you a quilt I'm working on at the moment. It's a gift for a family member and they requested colourful, so that was the brief. And as you can see, I'm right on it. Lots and lots of scraps have gone into this, and I'm sort of halfway through, I would say. And as I'm adding more rows and build up more blocks, I thought I'd share the process with you. Apart from the fabrics, the materials I'm using are a rotary cutter and a variety of quilting rulers. Some of the elements are 4.5 inch and 2.5 inches, so these are coming in really handy. And the individual blocks I square up using a larger one. Now this turntable style cutting mat it's by the Quilted Bear, but I'm sure there's other brands probably available. I tell you, it's been such a revelation because it's saving a lot of time. I use it for a lot of the small elements that I'm cutting. Right, so I haven't followed a pattern for this quilt. Literally made it up on the spot. So you could say it's freestyle, I suppose. The elements are all made up of the 2.5 inch strips, so I cut them into squares and 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches, and then I've got 4.5 inch squares that I've used that ruler for. So those are basically the 3 sizes that I'm putting together. Step 1 is to join one of the squares to one of the oblong strips, and also an oblong strip to the 4.5 inch squares. I've not really done much planning at this stage, just sort of added together what looks nice, bit of variety, bit of contrast, you know, sort of richer colours and lighter colours, a nice mix. And also I varied the positions of how I was adding the strips onto the squares. And I mean, some pieces where the pattern isn't necessarily directional, you know, you're quite flexible, but other than that, I just made sure that I had some with the square at the bottom as well as some where the square's on top. I've prepared these here, and they are at the pressing stage, and as you can see I chain piece them, and that's something I've talked about in a different video, in the crumb quilting video, which I'm gonna link above for you if you want to have a watch. So no back stitching, because you know, you sort of sew over it in the opposite direction anyway, and that'll secure the threads. So when it comes to pressing, I just wanted to just show you really how I press and give you a few thoughts. Something that I always do is set the seam. So as you can see here, because different fabrics, some are lighter, some are a bit heavier, the tension changes of the thread in relation to the what you're putting under the feed dogs, under the needle, sorry, and sometimes you end up with a bit of a wobbly seam, but setting the seam usually takes care of that. There you go, all done. And while the fabric is hot, I finger press. So I'm just putting this up, folding it up in readiness for the iron. And that gives you really nice and crisp seams. As a beginner, you're probably tempted to iron your quilt blocks like you would iron clothing, you know, where you sort of move back and forth. But what you would actually be doing is sort of push these out of shape, and you would stretch, and you'd sort of end up with creases and deformed seams, really. So pressing is literally just pressing down, giving it a few seconds and setting the seams that way. That's it. So this one is ready for just squaring up. With all these elements, I've given myself about a 1/4 inch just for trimming, and the final size that all these four blocks, for want of a better word, are is 6 1/4 inch. And I always use the edge of the this square ruler where the ones are, and have a look that I've got enough either side to trim. And I have a look here that sort of it's fairly aligned. But with this type of quilt, you don't need to be as precise, I think, because it's freestyle anyway. So once these are trimmed, and I do use the turntable for that, I put that corner here so that the one is then opposite. And now I go with the exact 6 1/4 by 6 1/4, and then trim the other 2 edges. And then you'll end up with a nice block like this. What really helps me visualize how it's all coming together is to pin up either on the wall, or, you know, if you have the luxury of having a design wall, or just laying it out on the couch and seeing how the next row might tie in with what's above it. And then I would lay the next element sort of underneath. And what I've found is quite often you might look at it a day and then you notice things that you really didn't see the first time round. And or sometimes a different pair of eyes where you've literally placed the same fabric so close together and you cannot see the wood for the trees anymore. So sometimes I wait attaching the next row just for a day or so if I have the time, just to make sure I haven't seen anything. Another tip is you can take a photo on your phone and set it to black and white, and that really highlights the values of the colours and would show up whether you've got a lot of dark patches, for example, quite close to each other, and whether things are distributed nicely. I just wanted to let you know about which way to press the seams, because I mean, some people like to press open seams, but what I've done for this, each sort of element has a main seam running through, and I've made sure that one row they're going one way, and the previous row they would be going the other, so that you can nest the seams and then you don't have too much bulk. I'm going to carry on with the quilt top, and when I'm at the next stage I'll be back with another video. So the next step would be to prepare it for making the quilt sandwich, and then using, I think I will use basting pins this time to make the quilt sandwich, and then part 3 will be the actual machine quilting and binding. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye. So once you've got your elements together, and you can do them in batches, as you probably don't want to get like 500 different fabrics out at the same time, you sort of join the 2 different elements together, and because of the variety of positioning, you can see here you have the slimmer side either to the left or the right of the square, or with some of these non-directional ones you can actually put it at the bottom or at the top, and that gives you the sort of freestyle look of the whole thing. And also whether you want to add 2 slim sides next to each other, and I've also added, just to switch things up a little bit, added individual elements like this, or one of these in between, just to break it up so it wasn't, you know, sort of too monotonous, if that makes sense. I also just wanted to share a quick tip with you. If you're short on wall space that you could use for a design wall to put quilt blocks up, you can, if you have, you can use a bookshelf, and I've put Velcro on the inside, self-adhesive Velcro, and the corresponding part on top of a linen curtain I sewed for this bookshelf, and it is actually removable, so you can take it off if you don't want to look at the curtain all the time. But it is so handy to pin either individual quilt blocks or you know, the whole quilt top and see it come together. The next step is for each row to set the seams on the back, and also to open the seams to press them open. So I won't subject you to a whole lot of pressing, but I just wanted to explain for those of you that are new to quilting perhaps, that at this stage you want to press open your seams to show you what that means. So this is the seam from the joining the rows, and if I were to press them either up or down, you're ending up with a load of bulk where you have those multiple seams. So in order to reduce and spread that a little bit, you would press open the seams. Sorry about the wobbling, but I've got the camera on the ironing board. So this is literally what it means. This is the fabric that I want to add as a border around the quilt top, and I do want the pattern to face the same way around the whole quilt, and that means that I have to cut the pieces for the top and the bottom this way, and the pieces for the sides lengthwise. I start by straightening up the edge as a starting point. I've decided to go with 3.5 inches for the strips. I reckon I probably need 3 or maybe 4 of these strips because it's not quite long enough for the width of the quilt, so I'll patch something together. Alright, and this is probably the time that you want to be thinking about replacing the blade when it's not cutting through everything as it should. One thing to bear in mind when you fold over a piece of fabric to cut strips, make sure that you have a fairly straight line at the bottom that's matching up with one of the grid lines, because if this was at an angle and you were to cut your strip, once you unfold it, you're ending up with a curve in the strip, and then if you're going to add it, trying to sew it onto something, you'll end up with gaps. Before I'm going to add the border, I just wanted to let you know that this is a good time to straighten up any edges to make sure that you've got right angles, and I probably will do this on the floor. That will make it a bit harder to film. Open up my large cutting mat, and then I've got space to do nice, I can't talk today, to do nice long cuts. And we have a quilt top. I'm so pleased with the border because it's tying the whole thing together really nicely. When I get a quilt top ready for basting, I always check the whole quilt top for any threads that might have come through the wrong side of the seam, anything that's transferred from any edges, and I actually trim back all these little threads here because, especially on lighter fabrics, they might they might shine through on the other side, and there is nothing more annoying on a finished quilt than seeing any threads come through. So as tedious as this might be, because it will take a long time, it is worth doing. Have a cup of tea, put an audiobook on or the radio, and grin and bear it, but it is worth doing. I just wanted to show you the wadding that I'm going to use. It's a super soft, and it really is super soft, eco blend of recycled cotton and recycled polyester. I've used it a couple of times before and was really happy with how it handled and you know, the drape of the quilt afterwards. So it's my go-to now. I went for the extra wide wadding because I do join leftover pieces together from different quilts so that I can reuse that for another quilt. I've actually done a video on how you can do that, which I'm going to link above. I also just really like the freedom of getting the double width or extra width of the wadding, because it doesn't limit the width of the quilt top that you're making. So if you want to improvise, for example, you know, by adding this border, you can, knowing that you're not going to waste any of the extra width anyway if you're going to join it together. So I've laid the quilt top on top of the wadding with a bit of extra going all the way around, and then I'm going to leave the same margin on this side and just cut so that it is going to be easier to handle. And of course, if you haven't got a long table, you can do this exactly the same process on the floor. When you end up with quite small pieces of wadding, you could, if you fancied, you could make these little quilted hearts or some bookmarks, and I've actually done videos on both, which I'm going to link above for you. I still haven't decided how I'm going to quilt this quilt because I'm quite limited with a narrow throat on my sewing machine, sort of how much I can feed through the side of it. So what I'm going to try is to roll this up and see if I can quilt horizontally or even diagonally, because that probably would be quite nice. I've not done that before, but I'm going to do a test run. So I've got the backing, then the wadding and the quilt top, so I'm going to simulate how I'm going to get it through the machine, which will then give me a bit more information on, you know, the decision making on the actual quilting. So I can just about get away with, once this is rolled diagonally, sort of halfway, to feed it through the throat of the sewing machine. So I'm going to go with diagonal quilting and crisscrossing. Again, I sincerely hope I don't live to regret this, because it will mean a lot of handling. But I like the idea, and I think it would go really nicely with the sort of square quilt top with a square pattern on it. So having decided on that, I now know how to baste. Because of the amount of handling that will be required, I think I'm going to do a mixture of spray basting and pin basting, and I'm going to bear in mind the lines I'm going to sew so that I'm not going to put the pins in the way, so that I can leave them in place and you know, they won't obstruct the sewing. So before I can make the quilt sandwich, I'm going back and give this quilt top as well as the quilt backing a good press, and then I'm also going to check the wadding and pick off any threads that might have attached themselves to make sure they're not going to shine through. And once that's all done, I'll be back. So I've started and put the quilt backing with the right side facing the table so that the left side is facing up, smoothed it out as best as possible, and used just this painter's tape, masking tape, to secure it on the table before I'm going to lay on top the wadding layer. I'm a little bit limited with how I can set up my phone to record, so I hope you can see all right, and you're okay to bear with me. Now, I just want to show you what I'm using for the spray basting. And you want to make sure that you have good ventilation. I would usually put a mask on probably as well, but since I'm going to talk a little bit, I won't for today. I just meant to say, you want this to be nice and flat, but what you don't want to do is stretch the backing too much, because it'll only sort of snap back and you'll end up with lots of wrinkles. So you do need to give this a good shake. I folded back the layer of wadding, and I'm just going to give this a light spraying so that there is some adhesion before I'm going to put some pins in. So it might be a little bit overkill, but because I know there's going to be a lot of handling, I think it'll help. So now I'm going to go over to the other end and roll the wadding back to the point where it catches, and then I'm going to spray a little bit over there as well, and repeat the same, smoothing it down. And after that I will move this whole thing over the table, so I'm going to take these sticky tapes off and do the other half. As you can see, I actually sprayed the adhesive onto the backing, but sometimes it may actually work better if you spray it onto the wadding. So there's, you know, different textures, they might adhere to it differently. So try the other if one doesn't work as well as you want it to. Also, I've not gone right to the very edge because I didn't want a lot of fall off to come down on the table, so I've just concentrated on the, you know, on the inner bits. So I'm just going to move this down. And I'm going to roll up the bottom half now again to where it catches from the layer of adhesive that we've just done, and going to carry on with the process. So I've just flipped the quilt over so the backing is facing upwards now, and I'm just going to give this another smooth. Always from the middle you want to be smoothing outwards so that you're moving out any, you can see any sort of wrinkles without stretching it, just giving it a gentle smooth. So now is the time to put your quilt top onto the wadding, and make sure that the backing and your quilt top are both facing up, because it's easily done to have the backing facing down and this facing up. It's just one of those really obvious things that is really easy to forget. Now also ensure that you have sort of equal amounts of spare wadding and backing all the way around including the bottom. And then again, same process. I'm going to smooth it all out and then fold back the top bit, give it a little spray, smooth it back, and then start rolling from the other side up to where it catches, spraying, smoothing, and then doing the last bit. And then I'm going to have a final think about the quilting lines, and that'll determine where I'm going to put some pins. So if you notice that maybe some of the seams are not lying nice and flat, you can actually lift this again and smooth it down again. Difference. So I always open up a load of basting pins, and I'm just going to put the camera down so that I can show you the pinning process. And these basting pins, they're curved to actually allow you to come up easier, and then you pop them closed. I don't mind doing this, and it doesn't really hurt my hands, but I know that other people find it a little bit difficult to get them closed up, and you could actually use a crochet hook or a pencil and just put it underneath to lift that back in there. It might help if you're having some issues. So also, please make sure that you will either protect your surface underneath, or that it doesn't matter if there's going to be you know, any scratches that these might cause. This is an old crafting table that's usually folded over, so it really doesn't matter here, but I have pinned on carpet before, and obviously you don't want to pin the carpet in, so you tend to lift the quilt a little bit to make sure the carpet isn't caught, and I didn't really get on with that very well. So I've done that on the office floor because I've got a little bit more space in the corridor there, but I think this way is actually going to be my preferred way going forward. So take the pin, pop it in so that it isn't actually in the way, and I'm going to pop another one here, making sure you get all layers. Sometimes either the pins might get a bit blunt if they've been used a lot, or you might, there it goes. Don't know, sometimes you might hit a seam. Just move it along just by a couple of millimeters and it might make a difference. So this is the line I'm gonna go. Usually I would start pinning from the middle, working my way out, but because I've spray basted, it wouldn't really matter this time. So I'm going to do the rows just across. I just wanted to add a note about the spacing of your pins. Each different type or brand of wadding has different requirements. Now this can be quilted as far as 8 inches apart, which is quite a lot, but some different brands, they might require sort of 4 or 5 inches apart, and you know, that will determine how many lines of quilting you will have to add, and hence how many pins you might need to put in, yeah, so that they're not in the way. So have a little think beforehand before you're placing them, whether you want dense quilting anyway as a matter of design choice perhaps, but always within the limitations of whatever the instructions of your wadding say. And if you're not spray basting as a security measure, then I would advise the pins to be no more than probably 5 inches apart. I mean, different quilters might have different ways of doing it, of course, but yeah, without the double measures, the more pins, the better really to keep things in place. So, change of plans. As I was pinning, it was really confusing me a little bit trying to find the line, because I didn't just use the 4 blocks, but because I used single 2.5 inch strips or single 4.5-inch strips just to break up the pattern. Obviously they're throwing the corners out. So what I'm going to do instead, I'm going to use my Hera marker, which is a wonderful tool. You're basically just going to score a line into the fabric. It will completely disappear with the first wash, and sometimes it might even relax to the point where you can struggle to see it by itself. So if I angle the camera, you can see here, and it really helps when you're sewing if you have a light at an angle so that you can see that line as a shadow. So all you do really is you use that edge, you line up where you want to mark, and then you're moving it along with a fair bit of pressure, and mark your line. And then you can move the ruler, and I'm using I'm literally doing the width of this ruler, and then I'm going to go and do the same diagonally, and I'm going to use the previous line just to line up and carry on. And then I can put the pins in the middle of those quilting lines. I just want to show you the line that I've just marked so you can actually see it. It's pretty good, isn't it? I just wanted to show you the difference it makes to actually shine a light from an angle and how it actually brings up these lines. Sorry. So that really helps later on with sewing. Just adding some more pins. So make sure you've got enough pins as well on the edges and also all the corners. So for quilting, I'm going to change to my walking foot. So each manufacturer will do their own version that would match your machine. It's always good practice as well to change to a new needle when you're starting a new quilting project. And I've got specific needles for quilting. And I do keep the old needles because they will still be okay for paper sewing. So anything to do with mixed media art, journaling, sewing on paper, or cardstock, these are really handy for, so they'll have a second life. I'm going to use different thread to the one that I used when I was piecing the quilt top. Before you start to quilt, it's a good idea just on the side, do a little test just to check the tension is okay. Because that can easily happen, you always start each new line of quilting off the actual quilt top, so that any threadness that may or may not happen, you can cut off later on when you're trimming the quilt. Okay, I'm going to roll up both sides of sort of the top right corner and the bottom left corner of the quilt, roll it together so that the middle diagonal line is the first line that I'm going to sew. And always backstitch, even though it's just off, it will just help to secure the thread. So here they are, and you can see the sort of silicone fingertips. Now, because I'm quilting diagonally, this line is going to be quite long, and I don't know if you can envisage this, but the rest of the quilt is draped all the way up across my left shoulder. Good God, this is gonna take ages. And it's actually quite important that nothing is obstructing the other side of the sewing machine, because if the quilt can't move, it's just gonna, you know, create a bit of a backstop, and it's preventing it from going through smoothly. Oh, we're getting to the bit where the bulk is starting to accumulate. At either side, so it feels really heavy. And I don't want the machine to struggle and stretch the fabric. Because this quilt is a gift, I just want to do a really nice job. So there's always a bit of added pressure when you're sewing for other people. Well, and if you've got a camera stuck on it as well. But I love sharing my processes with you, and I'm really grateful for everyone who does watch, so thank you. I mean it. And you can see if the machine is struggling to feed through, the stitch length sort of gets really, really short and looks like you've been sewing on the spot. So you're not pushing things through, you're letting the feed dogs from the walking foot and the ones at the bottom of the machine do the work, but it's, yeah, it's hard to explain, but you are basically carrying the weight of the quilt to make sure that it can move freely. So this is actually the worst one because it's the longest one. As I move each side, the lines are going to get a bit shorter with every single one. So I do go over a little bit, but not too much, because I do want to reuse as much as I can of what I'm going to cut off. And it's a bit of a pain to remove any stitches, so yeah, maybe an inch, and that should do the trick. So I've finished all the diagonal lines going in one direction, and actually the first line that you witnessed was the most difficult one. It did actually get easier thereafter. So what I'm going to do now is mark, again with a Hera marker, mark the next set of lines going perpendicular to the first set, and then go through the whole process again. So I shall see you in a little while. Hello again. Guess who's a little bleary-eyed this morning and couldn't stop quilting last night? But I'm really, really pleased that I did go with the diagonal quilt lines. Really chuffed. I think I might add even more lines today because I want a little bit more of that delicious quilty texture that is starting to develop. So I've just taken all the basting pins out because I've done the spray basting as well, and it I think it will be fine. Famous last words. I will use the Hera marker again and mark the lines, but I think today I'll mark the lines on the back because they'll be really nice and visible now, because I do want to match and go through each of the points. So that's what I'm going to do next. I just wanted to show you how I roll up the quilt each side, and this is the line I'm going to sew now. So I'm going to grip each side as I'm feeding it through the machine, and when you start at the top, all this would be over your shoulder, and it depends a little bit on the weight distribution and your own physicality, whether you use your left or your right shoulder. You can probably just about make out is this pink line. I found that the Hera marker, because of the stitching, was throwing sort of little creases because the fabric was behaving differently than compared to when there wasn't any quilting at all. So I switched to a chalk pen and I went for just a light pink. And I'm also starting, because I've flipped the quilt over and I can't see the edge because this is overhanging the front, you know, the quilt top. I'm starting a little bit above the lines from the first lot of quilting, just to make sure that I'm definitely catching the edge. And just one other thing, if you are flipping your quilt over and doing quilting from the back, just don't forget to change your top thread, because I'm now using the same thread that was in the bobbin thread beforehand. And I'm making sure that I'm not sewing like this, but that I'm sort of smoothing the fabric without stretching it. And you constantly have to sort of readjust and rearrange the weight of the quilt. So I'm doing this at real speed for you because I don't think it will be very helpful, you know, to see something sped up and you think, God, that's how I'm supposed to sew, because it isn't. This is real life. So just making sure I'm past that line a little bit. Put a back stitch. And that's it. So I just wanted to show you the progress after quilting the horizontal lines, and I've gone through every other point. Next step, because there's now squares that haven't got any lines going through it, and I'm going through that way. So I'll have triangles facing in different directions. And this is how it looks on the front so far. So you can see every other has a line going through it. And this is where I'm going next, vertically. So more marking, and as I mentioned before, the Hera marker going this way now was just throwing a few creases. So I've swapped to a water-soluble pencil, chalk pencil by Clover, which is really doing the trick nicely. So I'm lining up just slightly next to the point I want to go through, so that the actual line is bang on. And I'm reassessing each square as I go along, just in case they're not on an absolutely straight line. I'm back, and I've finished all the quilting. So I thought I'd give you a little update on how it's looking. Here you can see the points, so I've gone this way, that way, over the diagonal lines from the first lot of quilting. So this is how it's looking now. With the quilting finished, it's now time to trim off the excess wadding and the backing. And it's also a good chance to just straighten up the lines and make sure that you have nice right angles in all sorry, on all four corners. And I have actually done a tutorial on how to just prevent your ruler from slipping, which I'll link above for you. It's only a really quick watch, but quite handy if you have problems with the ruler going in all sorts of directions. So I'm just moving this up and just make sure I follow on the line from before, and you can see it's sort of starting to veer off a little bit, so I'm just changing the line. Okay. Okay, I'll take the camera off for a minute because I think you get the idea. So you just go all the way around and I'll meet you back. So what I'm going to do before getting the binding made and attached is to sew a straight stitch line across the whole quilt just to secure the edges here, and I'm going to do 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I have a setting, I'll show you, on my machine which lets me move the needle to the left. So if I follow the middle of the foot as a guide, with the needle moved to the left, that would give me an automatic 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I hope that makes sense. Now, I want to get a clean start, and to lift the back of the presser foot will help because you're not going to having to sew uphill. So I'm just going to use one of my bookmark corners. I'm going to link the tutorial above if you fancy making a few using some of your scraps. So you can see it's going to be a help for the sorry, it's the curse of filming. Right, that should do it. Okay. And then I'm literally just using this as a guide and keeping that aligned. And just a tip, if you're sort of fairly new to sewing, to get straight lines, don't look at the needle, just look here or here, because otherwise you take your eye off and you sort of start going in different directions. So you get the idea. I'll meet you back once I've gone all the way around. I just wanted to give you a tip. Having switched to the regular sewing foot, that does mean that the fabric is only going to be moved by the feed docks here at the bottom, and there might be little areas where you have excess fabric on the top. So what you can use is a bookbinding awl. This was literally just a couple of quid online, or I think there is even longer ones, pointier ones, they're called stilettos, and you can use them just to feed the fabric through and ease it in bit by bit, and that way you'll prevent sort of proper puckering that you would see otherwise later on. I hope that helps. So I'm back with the fabric for the binding. I've just given this a little iron, folded it over twice, so that's a fold and there's another fold here, and just make sure that the folds are lining up and are straight, because if one is sort of going off, when you unfold it, you'll have kinks in your binding, which is not gonna work. So to start off with, I will straighten up the edge, and believe it or not, but I do save all these bits, especially these little tapered ends. They're really handy for making fabric beads. I've just done a recent tutorial, I'll just link it above. So reuse as much as you can to reduce fabric waste. My philosophy anyway. Right, okay, so standard width for binding strips are 2.5 inches. So half, 1, 2, and I think I'm going to cut 6 strips and see how far I get with it. Okay, I'll see you back in a minute when I show you how to join the strips together. So there's 2 different ways to join your binding strips. The easier way and quicker way is to right sides facing, to put them together, sew a line down here and then trim it back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The other way, which is my preferred way, takes just a moment longer, but it distributes the weight and the bulk better. So this is my preferred way, and it doesn't take that long. You can sort of chain piece them together. So make sure they're sort of perpendicular to each other, and then you will draw a line just to guide you where you're going to sew from that point to that point. And I usually prepare all the strips ahead of sewing so that I can just chain piece them in one go. Just one little thing to remember: if you're using a fabric that doesn't have an obvious right or wrong side, just bear in mind when you're adding the strips together, so if this is your first one, to remember to flip it up before adding your next one, because if you forget to flip it up, you'll have seams on alternating sides, which obviously is not going to work. So this is what I meant by chain piecing. So without cutting the thread, you're just going to carry on with the next piece. The next one. There we go. And then you just cut the thread. If you have a thread cutter on the side of your machine, or just use little snips. And the next step is just to take, mind you, you can eyeball it as well, just use scissors about 1/4 inch, or use your rotary blade to cut the excess bits off. And then it's time to press. Right, I've just walked this along the outside of the quilt, and the 6 strips were enough for that size quilt, including an overlap for joining later on. So the next thing you will do is fold this in half. And I'll just show you the seams. You want to be opening like this. I do usually just set them as well, like this, so they're nice and flat. And then you carry on doing this for the whole length. And I'll see you back with the finished binding. Welcome back. So with the binding all prepared, now we want to attach this to the edge of the quilt, so that we'll fold this over as the last step in order to enclose the raw edge. So I usually start down one of the long sides, about halfway down or 2/3 down, and you can use clips if you like. I think some people might even prefer pins, or you can just not use any and just sort of feed it in as you sew along. The important thing is to leave a section for joining when you get to the other end. So, you know, leave yourself plenty. The shorter this is, the more tricky it's going to get. So just make your life easy and leave a nice long strip. So I've just switched to the 1/4 inch foot. If you haven't got one, you can use the markings on your machine, or put a strip of, measure a 1/4 inch and then put a strip of masking tape all the way down that you can then line the fabric up against as a guide. So if you see me shake a little bit, it's not the sheer excitement of doing the binding. I've just had a rather strong coffee. Probably not the best timing. So don't forget to backstitch generously, I would say, just to make sure the seam is going to hold when you join later. Just carry on until you get just before the next corner, and I'll just show you how to get around the corners in a minute. Okay, so I'm about to hit the first corner, and what you want to do is stop sewing a 1/4 inch before the corner, and then diagonally come down to that point and run off. You can roughly use your fingers as a guide, or you can actually mark it on the top here. It's up to you what you feel comfortable with. I usually just like to check when I pivot this and look underneath, just to see that I've got roughly, you know, the same amount of quilt either side, and that's usually a good enough marker. And then you come off, lift the needle, see, and then cut the thread if you had scissors. Hang on. So the next step from here, you fold the bias up like so, so that you have a nice sharp right angle here, and then you fold it back, and we will start sewing with the same 1/4 inch seam allowance right, well, from here, and then back stitch to catch the corner. Again, you can put something under the back of the presser foot, just so that you're sewing level and don't have to struggle uphill. And you want this to be level and I usually pop a clip on there just to keep this in place. So you're level here, you've got a nice, neat and crisp corner, and you'll start sewing again from here. And back stitch right up to the edge. Okay, right, that's it. And make sure any fray is pointing out, because if it's caught underneath, it will stick out on the nice side later, and you'll have to do a lot of tidying up. So just carry on until you've done the other corners, the remaining ones, and I'll meet you back to show you how to join both pieces. Just a quick note on the binding: before you attach it, it's always a good idea to check where the seams are going to fall, to make sure that they're not going to coincide with the corners, because having the additional fabric here with the seam allowance on the inside and then the folding along the corners, that would make it really awkward. So it's time to join both ends of the binding. I've left a gap of about 9 inches, and you don't really want to have this any shorter because it's going to get a bit awkward and fiddly. So I've already trimmed this side to sort of just a little over from the middle of the gap, and don't forget to backstitch, you know, at the start and the end. And take a piece of what you've trimmed off, because you need this as a measure, because you want to have overlap of 2.5 inches, which is the exact width of the binding that I've used. So if you're using wider binding, then cut a piece of whatever your binding is and use that as a measure. So just lay this a little bit over so you can see the overlap. And what you want to do is take your measuring piece and align it with the end of that end. And then you want to make a cut where the overlap ends. And please make sure you cut at this end, because if you cut here, you won't have anything to overlap, and you'll be in trouble. So just trim this off. So there's your overlap. I am going to open this out and fold this corner towards me and align it with the edge here, and then start finger pressing this line, and that will be our seam line later. So you want right sides touching, of course. So this is the overlap. So take this corner and align it with that side. Just to help you, if you just pop a pin in there for a minute, it is a bit easier if you put a clip just to hold these bits together, because otherwise they keep pulling in all sorts of directions, and that will make it easier to get these aligned properly. Okay, so this is where we put the pin, and I'm going to put some pins on the sewing line that I've just finger pressed, and it's best to use pins that don't have any sort of ornamental like flowers or hearts or so up here, and you'll see why in a second. So this is right on top of the sewing line. Take this one out on the corner, take the clip off, and then you can just double check that you haven't got yourself in a twist here. So you can see it's all lying flat, well, sort of flat, and you're good to go sewing this line. And I will pop that clip back on. It's just making it a lot easier. So I'm just going to move the pins back off the sewing line. And I'm just going to pop them either side. This bit is really fiddly, so just take your time. It is worth it. And then you want to be sewing from that point diagonally to where you're joining the other corner overlap. So I hope you can see all right. I'm just double checking that I'm sort of on course for that corner. And because we've double checked that nothing is twisted, famous last words, you're good to just trim this to 1/4 inch, roughly, seam allowance. You can either take this over to your iron if the seam is a little bit puckered, but this is looking all right. So I'm going to just finger press the seam open just to distribute the bulk. That should do it. Remove the clip and I'll just flip back the quilt, and voila, look at that. So we can just complete the line and just make sure the seam allowance is nice and flat on the inside. Find where you backstitch, and I usually start a little bit above. Backstitch again. Hello and welcome back. It's time to bind the quilt today, and I usually like to hand sew the binding, as you get a really lovely finish. But do feel free, if you prefer machine binding, to go ahead and do that. Now what you'll need is thread, and I'm using this here in a colour that's sort of quite close to the backing fabric, a few clips, and a hand sewing needle. And I usually start with adding a quilter's knot. So you have the needle in your left, the end of the thread like so, and the more times you wrap the thread around the needle, the thicker the knot gets. Because the thread's quite thin, I've done a few wraps, and then you don't move those three fingers on your left, and just pull through until you can feel the knot. So what I do to start with, I do like to pin a little section ahead of me, because then I can get into a nice rhythm with the hand quilting. And I'm sort of pulling down a little bit, and you want this to be quite even all the way down. I want to show you the corner, so I'm going to start quite close to it. You want to get a really nice crisp line on the front of the quilt. So I usually do a little bit of finger pressing. Just getting those covered. And then you want to meet both these edges here in the middle. And when I'm happy with it, I just pop a pin, I keep calling these pins, I don't know why. Pop a clip on there, and that'll keep it in place for when you reach that area. So I'm quilting going that way, but of course if you are left-handed, then you'll be going in the other direction. To start with, I just take the thread into the seam allowance. And just do a simple knot, and that'll be fine. So what I use is a ladder stitch. So what it means basically, you're going up into the crease and then you travel the needle inside the crease, you come out and you do another straight stitch and then you travel along inside the sort of in the wadding really, and then you come up, you do another straight so that it looks like this, like a ladder. And I usually do a few stitches at a time, and then when you pull the thread, it's all closing up. And it's also a bit quicker. I used to do stitch by stitch, and then a lovely sewing friend from our charity quilting group from Project Linus showed me her way, and she was always doing a few stitches at a time, and yeah, amazingly quick and yet amazingly accurate. I hope you can see. Come up, and then I always try to hit literally the uppermost corner, and then you don't want to go across because that thread would show. So come down quite close here, make a little stitch, and then where you've come up you want to go back into that crease. I'm making really quite small stitches. I think you could probably make them a bit larger. I often try, but then I sort of just revert back to these small stitches, and I don't know, it must just be the way my brain wants to do things. And then you come up, and you can move the clip along, back in there, back in the top of the crease. So you can see that the stitches are virtually invisible. When you run out of thread, just a note, just take it into the seam allowance with a couple of knots, and literally do what I did at the beginning, just to start a new thread. When your thread is still quite long and you're pulling it through, depending on the brand of thread that you're using, some tangle more than others. This one's quite good, but just pop your finger loosely on there and you're usually all right. So I've just done that little section. And it is so satisfying to have a really lovely finish on the quilt. It just frames the whole thing, I think. So personally, I do like to take my time over it, and it's very relaxing when, you know, you get into a nice rhythm with the stitching. It almost becomes meditative. And if you like, just put podcast on, have a cup of tea, and just switch off from the day. So when you get to the corner, so I've just come out of the top of the orange. Try and come up really close to that point. Oh, typical. Right. Okay. And then I catch, because you sort of want a right angle, I catch that little corner from underneath. And anchor it down. So you'll carry on that way and clip just to prepare the next few inches and make your way around. I'm trying to show you at a little different angle. I'm slightly contorting myself here. So yeah, there's that little corner done. This is how I hand quilt. I hope you found it helpful. And I'll see you again soon. Thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.